In today's deep dive on tariffs, we're going to talk about President Trump and his multi-decade-long love for this policy that, frankly, most people had turned their backs on over the last century. We'll look at a timeline because it's been hard to follow the headlines as it relates to tariffs. And finally, we'll take a look at a proposed 200% tariff on pharmaceuticals, a 232 investigation, what's that? And then we'll close by seeing what's on the horizon. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Making Medicine podcast, where science, policy, and innovation meet. As always, I'm your host, John Stanford. Today's episode is Talking Tariffs, a favorite topic and a timely one of President Trump. But what are the implications for these announcements? What do they mean, and how will they affect the life science ecosystem? We'll be breaking down the facts and discuss what still could be on the horizon. So with that, let's get into the show. For a long time, tariffs were a third rail of international politics. We learned in the 1920s and 30s they just weren't something you did. Ferris Bueller's Day Off famously has a scene where we all learned that tariffs just aren't great for the economy. But Donald Trump doesn't believe that, and he hasn't believed that for a long time. In fact, Donald Trump has been a supporter of using tariffs to achieve other policies since the 1970s and 1980s. It's part of his art of the deal. So when we think about President Trump and tariffs, we shouldn't think of it as an economist. He thinks of a tariff as being a deal maker. And certainly he is trying to leverage tariff policy to address his belief that America is losing to the world on a whole host of economic issues. The biggest one is our trade deficit, and he'd like to see tariff policy be used to more balance what the U.S. buys from other countries versus what it sells to the rest of the world. One of the challenges there, to be quite honest, is that while the U.S. is only home to about 5% of the world's population, we're a third of the world's purchasing power. And so it's going to be a challenge to try to have the individuals in Lesotho buying as much from Americans as Americans are buying from a small African country. But we've seen that be a key driver of why President Trump has taken aggressive steps and some of the steepest tariffs proposed in U.S. history. Let's break it down with a little bit of a timeline of where we've been so far. January 20th, 2025, President Trump is inaugurated, and tariffs are front and center about what he'll do next. In February, he announced his first step, targeting the auto industry. Then in March, it was the steel industry. At that point, pharmaceuticals and drugs seemed far off in the distance. But then came Liberation Day, and you probably heard about this. On April 2nd, Liberation Day, President Trump announced a 10% tariff on every country in the world. But that's not what made the news. He also announced reciprocal tariffs with nearly 100 countries that were significantly higher than what anyone expected. Some even got as high as 150% with key trading partners. Now, following that announcement, and following significant market turbulence after the announcement, President Trump announced a 90-day pause in which he hoped countries would make deals with the United States that improved the economics of our country's relationships. Throughout May and June, countries did keep discussing with the U.S., and we saw positive news out of the United Kingdom and Vietnam that deals could be on the horizon. But many key deals with Japan, with other EU trading partners, are yet to come to fruition. We also had the courts engage and block some of the tariffs temporarily, and there's been a lot of discussion about just how much power one person, the president, has to set trade policy with the entire world. But on July 9th, the 90-day pause came to an end with another delay. President Trump extended his delay another 3 weeks to August 1st to allow more discussion and possibly more deals. It's anyone's guess just how serious that timeline is. So what do these tariffs mean for the pharmaceutical industry? Well, for a long time, pharmaceuticals just simply weren't mentioned as part of the tariff conversation. For a long time, it's been important to not put additional taxes on medicines. In fact, they've been exempted from most tax policy around the world because people don't want to increase the price of medicines for patients. How the Trump administration was going to address pharmaceutical tariffs came into the fore over recent months, but especially in early July when President Trump floated a possible 200% tariff on pharmaceuticals. Now, he did, in true Trump style, lay out that it could take place over a year or 18 months. Even more recently, he said those tariffs could start at a lower level as early as August 1st. What we lack here is certainty about what these pharmaceutical tariffs even are. There's a lot of challenge in implementing a system that would put tariffs on drugs. And how it would work in practice is a question for all of us that frankly we don't have the answer to yet. Does it apply to drugs' active ingredients, where they're manufactured? Does it apply to where products are finished or where the IP is? The IP location of specific drugs is also something that isn't typically disclosed. So it's hard to gauge the impact on individual companies, which is why, frankly, the capital markets aren't making much of these announcements. President Trump's recent mention that August 1st may be a key date for tariffs on pharmaceuticals aligns with an ongoing investigation by the Department of Commerce, where they're using what is called a Section 232 investigation, which is fancy DC speak for assessing whether or not national security concerns could be involved with the importing or exporting of goods. So for the past several months, the Commerce Department has been asking key stakeholders, what's going on with the importing and exporting of medicines? And is there a national security risk to having key elements of our medicine manufacturing existing overseas, potentially in adversarial countries? Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick recently said that investigation is coming to a close. And the culmination of that and President Trump's announcement mean a possible real decision on tariffs could be coming as early as next month. Incubate weighed in on that Section 232 investigation because it was important to say that manufacturing medicines is a global and complex process forged over decades. And we are concerned that a sudden increase on the cost of medicines as they enter the United States could frankly lead to patients paying more at the counter. One of the goals of the Trump administration is certainly to bring more pharmaceutical manufacturing domestically, and companies have announced a slew of investments to make that happen, but that'll happen over a decade. So it'd be concerning to see tariffs implemented far swifter, and frankly, the impacts and how companies respond are almost impossible to predict. What we do know is that APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, come from all over the world. India supplies almost a third to the United States, Europe a fifth, and then other countries, including China, fill in the rest, as well as a healthy supply created at home. So we'll be watching closely for the output of this Section 232 investigation. If the recent months have been any guide, President Trump is going to be led by instinct. And his instinct is to keep taking on the pharmaceutical industry. Whether or not he's using tariffs as economists would is frankly irrelevant. Tariffs are one piece of the puzzle as he continues to change policy as it relates to this industry. For more on that and most favored nations, check out last week's episode. Section 232 refers to a section of the 1962 Trade Expansion Act, Section 232, which allows the U.S. Department of Commerce to investigate whether imports of certain goods pose a threat to national security. And if they do, it enables the president to impose tariffs or other trade restrictions. So why does that matter for us? Because the U.S. is at a critical moment about deciding whether or not making medicines in our country isn't just an economic imperative, but a national security one. And if it's the view of the Department of Commerce that our national security is threatened by APIs or finished products coming in from overseas, it gives the president a wide latitude to take steps to address that. It's fair to say that the industry has deep concerns about a proposed 200% tariff, what it means for patients, what it means for the cost of goods, and frankly, how it will be implemented in an industry that has diversified across countries over many decades. But we also know that President Trump is the eternal deal maker. And so I think industry is trying to understand how this tariff proposal also factors into broader efforts to onshore this industry that America is the world leader at. It's clear that he and his administration want to see not just the brilliant development of medicines to happen here, but also that their manufacturing happens here. and it's important to remember that he certainly will use tariffs to push other policies like that. It's hard to turn on CNBC or Bloomberg and not be faced with the conversation of tariffs. It's something that President Trump will continue to make a centerpiece of his administration. But how they'll impact the pharmaceutical industry? Will this 200% tariff materialize? And if so, when? And what will the implications be? We just simply still don't know. That's why we will continue to try to inform folks as we hear from the president and his team on what the next steps for tariffs are, both on the economy and for our industry specifically. Hopefully, this episode has given you a little insight into where things stand. But as with everything these days, it can change on a dime. And so that's why we hope you'll keep tuning in. Join us next week as we introduce our new segment, The Press Pass, where we'll bring on members of the media to share their take on the headlines and what's the real story behind them. Reminder to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can stay up to date on the world of policy and innovation. Follow us on LinkedIn, X, and Instagram using the links in the description of this video. And as always, keep innovating.